Hi, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. So today we'll be looking at this question of why a ladder of love or desire is necessary. You might remember, if you've watched the last few episodes in this series, that we've been talking about this image of the ladder of Eros brought forth to us in the Symposium by the prophetess Diotima, something that marks the climax, really, of the dialogue, and also is really the most important, or the central image of Platonic love. It encapsulates, I think, what's really unique about what Plato is trying to tell us through Diotima about Eros. And I think the uniqueness resides not so much in the idea of a psychic, or if you like, spiritual ascent, which is actually, of course, a fairly common theme in world culture. What's so original, or even you could say revolutionary or subversive, in Plato's account, as I think I mentioned last time, is that there's a putting in abstract or universal terms of what exactly spiritual ascent is. This isn't an account that's expressed only by means of images and works on us only through the imagination. And what we see that ascent really resides in for Plato is, I think, above all, in the reconciliation of what you could call subjective and objective desire, the desire for pleasure and the desire to be good, because this latter is a step-by-step process in the realization that ultimately these are identical ends in a way that kind of eludes us in the everyday. As we saw, the latter starts at eros, love or desire, in what you could call its most subjective form, a fixation on the beauty of another body, and it moves up to objects of desire that are ever more objective or universal as the lover goes through this upward cycle, this process of progressive enchantment, disillusion, and then re-enchantment with a higher object, so that it's kind of like an upward spiral staircase, actually, as much as it is a ladder. So to Eros, from Eros first, the process goes from infatuation with a single body to Eros, first for the beauty of many bodies, then to Eros for the beauty of the psyche, and so on, culminating in a vision of absolute beauty or goodness, and the realization that the subjective good or pleasure and the objective or universal good are grounded in a good that transcends or embraces their apparent division, really a kind of inconceivable good. And so the quest for either is ultimately satisfied by the same thing. It's a good that's in a way inconceivable, and yet in some way attainable. There's only one problem with this, at least as I see it, and that is it's never actually explained why we need to go through this process, which we might call, without, I think, too much of a stretch, phenomenological. And when I say this, I'm thinking, of course, about the original phenomenology of our time, Hegel's phenomenology of spirit or mind, and of how there's this idea of Geist, spirit or mind, or maybe you could even say psyche, also moving upward from a kind of partial to a complete conceptualization of reality by means of a dialectical process that is a reflection both on phenomena and on itself. In the words of Canadian philosopher Emile Fackenheim, the phenomenology, quote, will watch consciousness examine itself, a process in which each finite standpoint, which is fragmentary because it is finite, will point to one higher because it is less fragmentary, until finally, at the standpoint of absolute knowledge, all fragmentariness is transcended. unquote. And Hegel was trying to trace out the experience of consciousness in a way, the sense that it is drawn by logical, in a way, the sense that it is drawn by logical necessity to make of itself and of being. And this, the transcending of fragmentariness, is certainly what we see at the top of Diotima's ladder also, with the vision of or communion with the absolute good or beauty after a process of reflection on the self and the object of desire. It's actually hard, I find, not to suspect Hegel was aware of following a pattern set by Plato, because he also uses the image of a ladder to describe his own ascent that he's tracing out in the Phenomenology. He writes in the preface to the book of the standpoint of absolute knowledge, or what he also calls, quote, pure self-recognition in absolute otherness, unquote. He writes, the individual has the right to demand that science should at least provide him with a ladder to this standpoint. And of course, by science, he means something broader, really, than science in which the sense we mean it most of the time today. Rationality of systematic study. His right to demand that science should at least provide him with a ladder to this standpoint, should show him this standpoint within himself. This handing the individual a ladder to the absolute standpoint is, he says, what his phenomenology is intended to do. So this striking resemblance is all very neat, but it doesn't answer for us this question I brought up a bit earlier. Why do we need Diotima's ladder? I ask that because we can come to the same conclusion. We can arrive in a way at this absolute standpoint just through an abstract argumentation without anything remotely like this sort of experiential phenomenology of desire. In fact, we've walked through that process in earlier episodes. First, quite a while back now, we saw Diotima name the good as the object of eros, and I think this is really something that's kind of hard to argue with. What could we possibly desire other than the good, be it the real good or the apparent good? Then you may remember we left the Symposium because we needed to take a detour through other Platonic and even Neoplatonic writings in order to understand, among other things, what Plato, speaking in the Symposium through Diotima, means by the good. And what we found, of course, is that the Platonic good, or the good at the very least in the so-called Neoplatonic tradition, is nothing other than the one, the absolute unity of subjective and objective being. Because for the good to be what it is, it must not just be the good for us only, the subjective good, or a relative good, a relative entity in any way, but rather this thing that is not a thing, this object that actually transcends the subject-object distinction. So it was Plotinus who really made explicit for us that there's no way to conceptualize the absolute good than as the pure unity of being, subjective and object being in its absolute unity, which is kind of paradoxically is sort of also, as I mentioned, beyond conceptualization. And so couldn't our spiritual ascent consist in our acceptance of this new conception of what the ultimate object of our desire is, and our being both satisfied and transformed by it? Why is this latter, this kind of proto-phenomenology, necessary? Plato doesn't say, nor to my knowledge does anyone else in the entire Platonic tradition, or even in secondary literature to my knowledge, although I'd certainly love to hear of anything to the contrary. But I think there's a reason. But before I get to that, I think I need to talk about why, for Plato, a purely experiential or phenomenological, if you like, approach to desire wouldn't work. One of the most remarkable and I think really hopeful things about the Hegelian phenomenology is that all this ascent of Geist happens through logical necessity. And so there's a kind of inevitability to the spirit's progressive finding of itself. And we see a similar deep hope in Diotima's ladder also. One of the most remarkable things about it, actually, is this sense it conveys of Eros, like Hegelian Geist, being fundamentally self-realizing or self-fulfilling, starting even from the very, if you like, lowest level. The process by which it's satisfied, its progressive encounters, if you like, with these various phenomena, these various shinings forth of the good or beautiful, that's what phenomena means etymologically. It comes from this Greek verb phino, to shine. So it's various encounters with these sort of shinings forth of the good or beautiful. It's the process by which it's satisfied through these encounters is nothing other than the process by which the soul becomes better. And because this is what you could call a dialectical process, one ascends Diotima's ladder through a certain logical necessity, actually, there can even seem to be kind of inevitability about it. Plato might seem to be saying that human desire will always live itself out for the best, that you could say love will find a way. But it's not really quite that simple. First of all, there's one important difference between these two ladders I've been talking about. I think it's important that the movement Hegel is tracing out is not merely of individual Geist, but of Geist as such, the spirit of humanity as a whole. This process is certainly not something every individual climbs on their own. In fact, that's why it's necessary, even not just the spirit of humanity, but spirit as a whole. In fact, that's why it's necessary for Hegel, for philosophy, to give it as a ladder to individuals who would otherwise just be enmeshed in the struggles of everyday life. And of course, ascent to the top for Hegel is something that presumably would have become possible only in his own time. And when we look to Diotima's ladder, we see indications that here, too, this ascent is not going to be experienced by everyone. Progress up this ladder isn't guaranteed. She clarifies at several points that this is what happens if the rites of Eros are carried out correctly, if the lover is being guided correctly, and ean orthos, hegetai ha hegumenos, if the leader is leading properly. And she doesn't specify what she means by or who she means by the leader. But if the leader here is the leader here Eros itself or philosophy as a teacher of Eros? I think it probably doesn't matter that much. The point, I think, is that without this principle we've just mentioned, that the ultimate object of desire, the good, is also the one, we're likely to get stuck on our ascent. That is to say, a purely experiential or phenomenological approach wouldn't be sufficient. Perhaps we can even see this in our own lives. There seems to be something in human nature that yearns for transcendence, but also something that resists it. And so similarly, we hear these mixed messages about love in popular culture. Sometimes love will find a way, but sometimes love will tear us apart. I think there actually is something tragic about this ladder of Eros in itself, in that it captures a basic goodness in human desire, something in it that wants to manifest its truth. At least it will only really find satisfaction in the upward direction. But the tragic flaw lies in the absence in it, without philosophy, of that principle that is needed to keep it on track, that principle needed to fully enable its self-realization. This, I think, is due to an element that opposes this self-realization. And that is what we'll be looking at next time. I think what we'll find is that this element that makes a purely experiential, or you could say proto-phenomenological approach to desire insufficient is actually also what makes it necessary, as odd as that may sound. Anyway, that's the kind of thing I'll be exploring next time, and I hope to see you then. And until then, thanks again for watching.